52, the novel, by Greg Cox, book review. So, this is a review of the novelization of a comic book. 52 is a series that came out, when did it come out? 2007, I think, following Infinite Crisis. It was released by DC Comic Books. It was called 52, well, for a couple reasons, but one of the gimmicks was, there are 52 weeks in a year, and one issue came out every week, and in the comic book world, I believe it was supposed to take place in real time. So each time a new issue came out, like kind of 1 week had gone by in the comic book world. I read parts of the comic. I think the collected graphic novels came out in several editions, and I read the first one. But then I continued reading the story in the novelization. So DC Comics, I think Marvel Comics as well, but I'm focusing on DC, has been releasing some of their comic books in the form of novelization. So like they hire a novelist to write the comic. Write a novel based on the comic. And I've chosen to go with the novel instead of the original graphic novel, the original comic book, for a couple of reasons. One was accessibility. So, I was living out in Japan at the time, so it was kind of much easier just to take a paperback novel than to attempt to track down all the comic books that made up this series. And two, I had this idea, and maybe this was a crazy idea, but I had this idea that kind of reading novels kind of improved your mind more than a comic book did. Maybe that's just snobbery. But, I was still enough of a geek to be interested in comics, but kind of a bit self-conscious about reading comics into my late 20s, so going with the novelization instead. That's probably just snobbery. Anyways, the author here, Greg Cox, is also the same author who wrote the novelization of Infinite Crisis, another novel based on DC Comics, which I also have read and reviewed on this channel and enjoyed. If you go and look at Greg Cox's, if you Google his name or something and look at the books he's done, he's got a resume that consists almost entirely of television adaptations, like novelizations of television series, novelizations of comic books, and novelizations of movies. So, if I was going to be uncharitable, I would say that's pretty much the definition of a hack writer, isn't it? I mean, hack is a derogatory term, and the guy is much more talented than I am. But that is a definition of a hack writer, I believe. But to give credit where credit is due, he is very good at what he does. So both with Infinite Crisis, his novelization, which I read previously, and 52, he's managed to write a novelization of a comic book that doesn't feel like it's a novelization of a comic book. It feels like it's an independent work in its own right. It doesn't feel like you're missing out on anything, even though in this particular case he abridged the source material heavily. He was able to do it in such a way that there were no gaps in his narrative. It doesn't feel like you're missing out on anything or you need to go check the comic book. Sorry, I just said that, didn't I? It doesn't feel stilted or kind of like a stilted adaptation. It just kind of flows. It feels like it's a novel in its own right. He did, however, abridge the source material heavily. So this is a difference between his novelization of Infinite Crisis and his novelization of 52. Infinite Crisis, he didn't really abridge stuff. In fact, I think he may have even added in extra details. For 52, he abridged it. And I found an interview online where he was talking about this. This is quoting from the interview. He said, "When my editor first approached me about doing 52 as well meaning following up to Infinite Crisis, my first response was, how is that even humanly possible? We're talking 52 scripts here. Do the math. That's over 7 times more plot than Infinite Crisis. To be honest, I only agreed to take on the project after DC assured me that I would have a pretty free hand when it came to abridging the story. And boy, was I merciless when it came to excising characters and subplots. I fully expected to get lynched in effigy when some fans find out their favorite scenes or characters didn't make it into the novel. But there was just so much good material, I had to cut some of it out. If you want to know which characters I concentrated on, well, there's a reason that Booster Gold, Batwoman, and The Question are on the cover. Now, personally, I'm kind of disappointed by this. I would have been more than content to read the whole unabridged novelization of 52. And you know, like if it ran to like 2,000 pages, so what? There are plenty of books in the fantasy genre that go on and on and on, or like are huge door stoppers. I would have read it. At the very least, he could have at least doubled the page count. I mean, it's at 350 now. He could have easily gone to 600, I think. But that's my quibble as a fan. I think what he was saying in that interview is not that it wouldn't have been read, but that he didn't want to write it. Like, he didn't want to spend years of his life writing all that material. I think that's what he was saying, and maybe he's acknowledging that fans would have totally read it. He just didn't want to write it. Okay, anyways, all that aside, kind of on to the actual story of 52. After the events of Infinite Crisis, the big 3 of the DC universe have gone missing, which is Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And in fact, most of kind of the famous heroes of the Justice League are busy doing something else. So this kind of leaves a void where the minor superheroes kind of come in to fill the vacuum. Now, I say minor superheroes, but I should clarify, I mean minor in terms of like name recognition or popularity or something like that. One of the major players in 52 is Captain Marvel, the DC version of Captain Marvel. And he is every bit just as powerful as Superman, but DC Comic Books has historically not really known what to do with him. So he's kind of minor in terms of like comic book sales, nowadays at least. So, I am a huge geek. I really love these minor characters. I kind of get sick of the same kind of Superman, Batman over and over and over again, but I love kind of delving into kind of some of these lesser known characters. And if you're at all a fan of comic books, you know that both the DC and Marvel universe are just overpopulated with superheroes. I mean, I guess if you would try and think about it logically, it's ridiculous how many superpowered beings are in both universes. There can't possibly be enough crime for all of them to be required. But you can't think about these things too deeply if you're a comic book fan. So kind of talking about some of these unique minor league superheroes which kind of get brought to the forefront. There's Captain Marvel. Now, Captain Marvel, I guess I can't say he's entirely obscure anymore because we just had a big movie that came out about him, Shazam. Shazam being for copyright reasons, they can't call it Captain Marvel. But he has kind of a long history of DC where DC didn't know what to do with him. He was originally invented by Fawcett Comics as a ripoff of Superman. Then DC Comics sued them out of existence and then eventually acquired the rights to them. And for years he's been in the DC universe, but DC doesn't really know what to do with him. He's redundant because they've already got a Superman. He's from the 1940s, so he's this really kind of cheesy character with all these kind of yeah, stuff that was popular at the time in the world of the 1940s comics, like Talking Tigers and all these other kind of elements of the Marvel family, but don't kind of mesh well with the new kind of nitty-gritty, dark, modern comics. And he's also like a really clean-cut comic book character. You know, he's like an innocent boy who transforms into a superhero. Which is another reason I think DC Comics had never really known what to do with him. But I really find that fascinating, even though it doesn't maybe completely work, the tonal dissonance between kind of these 1940s characters and the modern kind of more dark storytelling, and how they try and kind of mash them together and make them work. And I think they largely pull it off in this comic. It's interesting, at least. They also, another fascinating thing is they get Black Adam, who has been Captain Marvel's nemesis. I would have said, actually, he's always kind of been historically Captain Marvel's nemesis, although I was reading online rather recently that Black Adam was never really a big deal in the 1940s version of Captain Marvel. I think he appeared like once or twice, but he was never a main antagonist. He became like a main antagonist when DC Comics acquired the rights in the 1970s. But at any rate, he's been a big part of the Captain Marvel mythos since the 1970s. Originally, he was kind of a bad guy, but over the years, DC Comic Books has kind of redesigned him as more of like a dark anti-hero, so he's not really a villain, kind of a villain, but kind of an anti-hero. And he gets a really prominent story in this book. And then there's Batwoman. Now, talking about kind of cheesy, anachronistic characters from days gone by, Batwoman was originally part of the Bat family from the 1950s. So this is a period where Batman was getting kind of really silly. They had Batwoman, Batgirl, Ace the Bat Hound, the Batmite, which was like this little superpowered imp. And then in the 1960s, when they were trying to make it more serious, they kind of faded them all out into the background. And eventually, Batwoman was kind of killed off at one point. But because DC Comic Books is kind of always resetting its continuity, several times, starting with the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, these characters are just kind of frequently brought back to life. And when they're brought back, they're often reinvented. And here she's reinvented. And they've decided to make her a lesbian character. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but this was big news at the time. This was not the first lesbian character in comic books, but this was the first time Batwoman was a lesbian character. So it's the first kind of lesbian Batwoman in comic books. It was a minor kind of media thing, like NPR did a story on it at the time, kind of talking about, you know, representation in comic books and changing times and stuff like that. Although I'm a little bit cynical, because I think I've not really done a formal analysis of this and done like quantitative data, but my impression is that there's a lot more lesbians in comic books than there are kind of homosexual males. And I think the reason is because it's a lot more easier to kind of depict, you know, figuring that the average audience for these superhero comic books is heavily male, to kind of have, you know, covers of lesbians kissing each other, or kind of these titillating artwork with lesbians, which maybe sells better with the male audience. So the comic book industry is maybe having their cake and eating it too. I mean, on the one hand, they're kind of coming out as oh so progressive. And on the other hand, they're selling these artwork about lesbians embracing each other is not doing badly with this male audience. Maybe I'm just being cynical. And then last but not least is the Question. Now the Question is another fascinating old comic book superhero that's got a lot of history. He was originally bought from Charlton Comics, another competitor of DC. He was created by Steve Ditko, kind of when Steve Ditko was going through his crazy Ayn Rand political phase. He's been underused the past 20 years, like a lot of the characters that DC bought from Charlton. But he's got a big chunk of the story here. So final thoughts on this. This is not great literature. Like you wouldn't want to compare this to Shakespeare or anything. But I think this is complex enough in its own right that we can legitimately say this is suitable entertainment for adults. I mean, it's not stupid kid stuff at this point. Which is not to say that the comic book industry doesn't have its highs and lows. Some of the stuff released around the same time or afterwards certainly was stupid kid stuff. But this 52 is good. The story and characters are complex enough. There are a lot of surprises along the way, but every single one of them is foreshadowed. They don't simply come out of nowhere as kind of like you know, the writers got desperate and so they just went in this direction. They set up all their plot twists in advance. And then the character motivations are complex and layered. As with any big comic book series, they're trying to kind of hype this up and increase the sales from week to week. So several heroes are killed, some of them are reborn, and some of them are recreated. The usual kind of comic book stuff, in other words. Entertainment Weekly, I think they were writing about the original comic book series, but they called it kind of equivalent to a gripping TV show. And you know, that's maybe the comparison I go with here. It's not Shakespeare. You can't compare it to high literature. But I think it's at least as complex and gripping and as appealing to adults as a TV show like Heroes or 24 or Lost or something like that. So if you can give time to those TV shows, you should find this on much the same level of sophistication. Whether you read the original comic book graphic novels or whether you read the novelization.